Hey everybody, Austin here again, and it's been a while face to face, but today we're going to be talking about the FM Towns Marty. FM Towns Marty was a game console that came out in 1993 by Fujitsu, and it's a pretty rare system. It's not one you see people have very frequently, it's not one that you see people talk about very frequently. For the longest time, especially in the late 90s, when video game collecting on the internet was still in its infancy, very few people even knew what the Marty was. A very obscure system, but it's a very cool system. It's based on the FM Towns computer line from Japan, which I believe that the computers came out in 1989 or so. And the Marty is basically a consoleized version of the early FM Towns computer models. And it's a CD-based console. As you can see, it's got the drive door right here, just like that. But what's really cool is it also takes floppy disks for certain games. Certain games might, I think, store data on the disks or read data off the disks. It's also got a dedicated keyboard port on the side. And it even takes a mouse, which you would use on the second controller port over here. The FM Towns Marty was a 32-bit system. And it really excelled at 16-bit style games, say like arcade games from like the late 80s and early 90s, two-dimensional stuff. For example, Splatterhouse is a really popular title on this system, and the FM Towns version is, or the FM Towns Marty version, it's basically a perfect arcade port. So there's really some cool stuff on this system. So we're going to basically just talk about it a little bit today. This is my personal FM Towns Marty. I actually bought it from a friend online about a year ago, maybe a little bit less than a year ago. And I've spent some good time with it. I've done a lot of Twitch streams with it. We've had what people have called Marty parties, where we basically just stream the FM Towns Marty for like 5 or 6 hours. And a lot of people have liked watching it. We're just going to talk about it. This is talking about, or it's sort of like a face-to-face show I'm going to start doing more frequently. I did it with the Apple Pippin a couple years ago. But I'm going to try to go through all my game consoles in my collection and talk about them and show you guys some gameplay and maybe talk about some of my personal memories. The reason we're starting with the FM Towns Marty is that I'm selling it. The FM Towns Marty, I've had it for about a year, maybe a little bit less. But I had a pinball machine come up for sale. A friend offered it to me, and as you guys know, I play a lot of pinball. That's kind of my primary focus in terms of where I put my money. And so the FM Towns Marty's probably the rarest console I own, and the most expensive. It was the easiest to get a lot of money for, and I also play it the least. Like, as much as I like this thing, it's a really cool system. It's a redundant system, unfortunately. The FM Towns Marty is a console where a lot of the games on it either aren't as good as they could be, or they're made redundant by being available elsewhere. And we'll talk about that at the end of this episode. I am parting with the Marty, which is why I'm covering the Marty first in this video series. Let's get right to it. The FM Towns Marty, again, 32-bit system. It's got a lot of old 16-bit style games on it, lots of two-dimensional stuff. Again, Splatterhouse is a good example. It's got a lot of arcade shoot-'em-ups, especially ones by Tollplan. And, it is a fun system. Here's the controller, actually. The controller is actually a really nice little shape. It's got a D-pad, 2 buttons, and unfortunately a top button, which doesn't really seem to do anything in most games. It's got, I believe it's a 9-pin controller port. Yeah, that's 9. And it's actually a really solid controller. I was really surprised by how comfortable the controller is, how nice it is to use. It's also got a start and select button. What's really interesting about this controller is it feels very much like an NES controller. For instance, the buttons, they have a very tactile feel, and they respond almost instantly like an NES controller. So for games like Raiden, where you're mashing the buttons really, really quickly, you can do that super fast on the FM Towns Marty controller, and it feels good. The D-pad also, much like an NES pad, even though it actually has the diagonals on it, it's very similar to an NES pad with how it responds to your inputs. It's a very slick controller. I like it. It's not too big. Granted, I also grew up with the NES controller. That was one of my most used and most loved controllers of all time. I love the NES controller, especially for old school games that require fast button mashing and precision. It's one of the best controllers out there for that. And the FM Towns Marty controller is very similar. I really, really like the controller. Again, like I mentioned, it also supports the mouse, which I guess you would just buy a standard FM Towns computer mouse. I haven't, so I assume that's how it works. Don't quote me on that. And again, it also has a keyboard port. Now, certain games on the system, unfortunately, do require the mouse or maybe a keyboard. I know for certain that I believe Lemmings, which apparently is a really nice port, and Operation Wolf, which appears to be arcade perfect as far as I can tell, will not play without a mouse, maybe a keyboard. I don't know because I don't have either accessory. I have not tried it. So the Marty has, it's interesting. It takes keyboards, it takes mice, it takes awesome controllers, much like an NES controller, and it's got a lot of great arcade ports. It's also got a lot of great, not so great, sorry, arcade ports. So before we go to the end and I talk about whether I think the system's worth it or not, or maybe who this is for as far as collectors and gamers go, let me talk a little bit about the game library and let me show you guys some gameplay footage from some games. So first up on the list, again, Splatterhouse. That's the one that everybody talks about on the FM Towns Marty. Once again, it's pretty much arcade perfect. It's a really great version of the game, and it's definitely a must-own on the system. It's hard, but it's the best version of this game. It's got eerie music, eerie sound effects, repetitive gameplay, but there's just an addictive feel to it that makes you want to keep coming back to it until you finish the game. And it's a difficult game. It's a memorizer. It requires skill to finish, but it's definitely in a league of its own. It's definitely worth playing if you have the Marty. So the Marty also has a ton of shoot-'em-ups. One of the most notorious ones is Raiden, or Raiden for some of us in North America, we might pronounce it that way. This is actually a pretty solid version of the game. Prior to the PlayStation's Raiden project, it was probably the closest to the arcade game. It's got some frame skipping starting at about halfway through level 2. It becomes difficult. More difficult to play it because it's like the Marty just can't keep up with what's going on. Now, from what I understand, later FM Towns computer models had more memory and so forth, potentially a faster CPU. The Marty, unfortunately, is at the lowest end of its tier, and so where Raiden might run perfectly on like a higher-end FM Towns computer, it struggles a little bit on the Marty, but still overall, the frame skipping at parts is tolerable. It's got a pretty cool remix soundtrack. And it's got pretty much most of the sound effects from the arcade game. It's a really nice game. Also really worth playing on the Marty. Now what's kind of interesting about the Marty is while it has the arcade ports, it's also got some computer ports. And while I'm not going to really talk about more than one of these, the most notorious one I can talk about, aside from Lemmings, which I've already mentioned, is Shadow of the Beast. And this version of Shadow of the Beast appears to be somewhat based on, I believe, the PC Engine CD version of the game. It's got the same music, which I think the music was done by JVC or Victor, same company. I think it was. I'm not 100% sure. But it's not a bad version of the game. And it's actually, if you're a Shadow of the Beast fan, it's definitely worth trying out as well. It's got some nice graphics. Unfortunately, the frame rate is a little sluggish compared to, say, the Sega Genesis or Mega Drive version or the Amiga original. But it's kind of hard to convey on camera because I'm not recording this gameplay footage at 60 frames a second. So you're not going to notice the sluggish nature, but it is there. Some enemies also have a tendency of really ganging up on you. Like, they're not spaced out very well compared to other versions of Shadow of the Beast. But still, it's a cool game nonetheless if you're a fan of the series. I'm a big fan of the Shadow of the Beast series. I've played most of the versions out there and really enjoy most of them, actually. So yeah, it had some more Western style computer ports on it. It's got some Ultima games on it. It's got Wing Commander. It's got some really interesting stuff that you probably wouldn't expect from a Japanese exclusive video game console. Now back to the arcade ports and shoot 'em ups. It's also got Sky Shark, which is a really nice version of this game. From what I can tell, well, actually I can't tell because I've never actually played the arcade game, but from what I would assume is this is probably arcade perfect, minus the new remix soundtrack, which a lot of Marty games have a tendency of having. Twin Cobra, another one I'd love to show you, but I can't because the disc is bad that I have. It also has a remix soundtrack, and a lot of these shoot 'em ups ported to the Marty have upgraded soundtracks. So if you're a big fan of the arcade games, that's a benefit. Sky Shark, again, pretty cool game, very, very difficult. If you get power-ups, the rank increases, and so the bullets become insanely fast in this game, and it's very difficult to recover if you die. Still a really cool game though, one of the ones worth playing. One of the other biggest games on the Marty, aside from Splatterhouse and Raiden, is Truxton 2, aka Tatsujin no something or another. I don't know how to exactly pronounce the Japanese name. But really fantastic shooter by Toa Plant. Again, it's just extremely difficult. But it's got some nice graphics, some decent music, and the music doesn't really appeal to me that much, but some people are going to love this soundtrack. It does sound good, at least. And it's a really solid game. A lot of people talk about Truxton on the Genesis and Mega Drive. Truxton 2, in my opinion, is a much better game. It's getting more modern compared to the first Truxton. The first Truxton maybe hasn't aged the best, but Truxton 2 is just lots of stuff going on. Great, colorful graphics, and it's just definitely one of the must-owns on the Marty, must-plays anyway, if you're a fan of shoot-'em-ups. So again, the Marty's got a lot of really cool games, as I've just shown you. It's got reasons to play it. Unfortunately, some of the games aren't that great. Some of the arcade ports aren't that great. One example is Turbo Outrun, which I'm going to show you right here. Turbo Outrun is just extremely sluggish compared to the arcade game. It's probably a step up from the Genesis / Mega Drive version. Like, didn't really come out in North America on Genesis, but the Japanese Mega Drive version, which is notoriously bad. The FM Towns Marty version is probably better, probably more colorful. It's actually playable. It's got a decent soundtrack at points. It's got some remix tunes. And what's interesting about this game, I noticed from streaming it last night on Twitch, is that it actually has hard rock music remixed from the arcade game, but then it also has like dance music remixed from the arcade. So you've got some of these tracks are like really fast and heavy in the arcade, and then they converted those to dance remixes, which they're still good and they actually sound really good, but the vibe of the game just feels completely different at certain points. It's a playable game on the Marty. It's just not that great. It's, you've got your turbo functionality, but when you use your turbo functionality, you don't actually feel like you're going that fast. The second you tap your brakes, or you try to go around a corner, you just literally stop. It feels like you just stop in place, and it's very cumbersome to play. Another example of a sort of a poor arcade conversion, and actually this one is actually enjoyable. I will say this one's enjoyable, but Galaxy Force 2 on the Marty. It doesn't run nearly as well as the arcade version, or the Saturn version, or any like the 3DS version. It's far from arcade perfect. It does actually look decent. Unfortunately, because of the resolution, it only fills up about this much of your TV, pretending like this is your whole television. The screen size is very small, and the frame rate's not the best. Soundtrack is pretty good, but it's definitely one of those arcade ports that might have been able to be done better had more time been put into it. I don't know. I'm not a programmer. But judging by some other stuff I've seen, it might have been able to do better. I'm trying to think of what other... There are some really other bad ports I played, but my mind is drawing a blank right now. One other good port, though, and unfortunately this isn't really something that would impress on the Marty, but is Bubble Bobble. Bubble Bobble is looks very close to the arcade game, sounds very much like the arcade game, and it's a lot of fun on the Marty. I was playing that last night on stream as well. So, yeah, those are some games on the Marty. I would talk more about them. I didn't really do any research prior to doing this. I'm doing this all improv off the top of my head in one take. So yeah, is the Marty worth owning? That is the question, and that is going to be the topic for the ending of this episode. Unfortunately, I feel the Marty is really best suited to hardcore gamers / collectors that really want to have personal hands-on first-hand experience with consoles like this, rare consoles that not everybody's going to have the chance to play. I've always considered myself in that camp. While I don't really collect video games themselves hardcore anymore, I do still like to collect the hardware. And one of the great things about the Marty is that it takes backups. You don't have to go out and buy its games. If you're okay with that, you can just buy the console. That is a benefit to it. But the problem with the Marty is that it's expensive. It's going to cost you at least $350 for the bare console and a controller and hookups. It does take composite and S-video, so even if it doesn't come with video cables, you can just use any generic S-video or composite connection there. Again, the problem with the Marty is that, for one, it's expensive. $350 minimum, that's probably before shipping. And if you're buying it from Japan, shipping's going to be $70 minimum. You're probably looking at $400 something for a bare Marty. If you want a complete in-box one, like I intend on doing in the future, I intend on owning another Marty, but box, you're looking at $450, $500 plus dollars. That's a big investment. That's money you could be spent putting towards other systems. Do you not have a Genesis and Sega CD and a Dreamcast, or maybe an original Xbox or a Saturn? You can buy all of those together and still have money left over for what it costs to buy an FM Towns Marty. So the FM Towns Marty, for one, it's a hard sell based on that fact. However, the other hard sell, the other factor that makes it a hard sell, is that many of the titles are redundant. There's very few exclusive titles on the system. Even Splatterhouse, for instance, the game that everybody raves about on the Marty, you can get it on the Splatterhouse for Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. It's an unlockable, it's emulated of the arcade, but it's about as close as you're going to get without actually owning the arcade board or playing the Marty version. And that game's like $10 or $15 as of recording this video. Raiden, another perfect example. You can get that on modern emulation packs, like .emu has their Raiden Legacy Collection. Don't really recommend buying that because it's just not that great, but that is an option. It might cost you $5 to $10 and you get other Raiden games with it. But the biggest one that makes the FM Towns version redundant is the PlayStation Raiden Project, which includes both Raiden and Raiden 2. I know I'm bouncing back and forth on how I pronounce them. I like to pronounce it both ways. Pretty much arcade perfect as far as I can tell. I know super hardcore people will be really picky about very specific little tiny details. But even with those little tiny details not being 100% accurate to the arcade, I'd say it's still a big step up from the FM Towns version. There's no frame skipping. There's no slowdown on Raiden Project. It's got the original arcade soundtrack, which unfortunately the Marty version does not have. You're forced to listen to the remake soundtrack, which is good and bad. I personally actually prefer the original arcade soundtrack for Raiden. So again, that's redundant. Bubble Bobble, glowing review I just gave it. You can buy it on the Taito Legends arcade compilations for Xbox, PlayStation 2, and a couple of other platforms. There's just so much stuff on the system that unfortunately you can just get elsewhere. Truxton 2 is probably the one game that is hard to get elsewhere outside of emulation. Now you could just fire it up in MAME on your computer or your modded original Xbox or Wii or something like that. But Truxton 2, as far as I can tell, wasn't really ported elsewhere. So that is one game you could check out. Sky Shark is another one that's a really solid game. But that's a shooter that I think has limited appeal. Not everybody's into the old toe plan shoot 'em ups. They're very difficult. There's always start back mode when you die. So you die and you go back to a checkpoint and you always start off with no power-ups. Really fun game to me, might not be for everybody. Even some of the arcade ports that are kind of so-so, like Galaxy Force 2, you can get a perfect port on the PlayStation 2, Nintendo 3DS, Sega Saturn, etc., etc. And that is the big problem with the FM Towns Marty, is while the system is really fun, it is just redundant. And so it's a really hard recommendation. I feel that in order to really enjoy the Marty, you have to have a very specific kind of personality. You need to be okay with spending a lot of money. You need to be buying the system not because you just want to be elite about your collection. You want to be able to tell people you own this really rare item. That's not why you would buy a Marty. You would want to buy a Marty because you really want to experience the stuff firsthand, truly experience the system and its games, and not use it as an ego boost. Just the good thing about the Marty is if you do choose to buy one, you can get your money back from it, just like I am. I sold it for pretty much the same amount that I paid for it. Had my fun with it. And if this pinball machine didn't come up for sale, I wouldn't have sold it. It would still be sitting in my entertainment center over here. But yeah, I sold it, and I will get another one in the future because I'm that kind of person. So yeah, it's still a really cool system. It's a really neat piece of video game console history, at least from Japan, because it wasn't released outside of Japan. And it's fun. It's just redundant. So it's not a system I can recommend to most gamers and collectors, but a very specific type. I know I'm not going to be able to talk out of it, like myself. If I talk to myself, if I could go back in time about a year and talk to myself about the Marty, I probably wouldn't have talked myself out of it. I still would have bought it because I had never experienced it before, and I wanted to experience the games firsthand for myself. I didn't want to rely on YouTube videos, and I wanted to stream it. I wanted to do some YouTube videos, which unfortunately I never did, but that's what this is for right here, as we say farewell to my Marty. This is officially the last day, or second to last day, I'm going to have it, and so this video will also double as sort of a documentation of my FM TOWNS Marty system. So again, really cool system. It's fun. I like it, but hard sell for most collectors. But here it is in the flesh, the FM TOWNS Marty. So yeah, that's basically it, guys. I'm going to go ahead and wrap things up. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Expect more face-to-face talking about videos where I talk about my game collection. Other consoles will have the boxes and stuff like that, so I can show you the packaging and whatnot. My FM TOWNS Marty, unfortunately, does not. But stay tuned for those, and be sure to shoot some comments down below. Let me know if you like this video, and feel free to give me a subscribe, or follow, or whatever it is on YouTube. Feel free to subscribe if you like what you see here. I'll be back with more videos like this. So thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you later.